Construction for you.
Alright guys, so tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about some face rigging and some different types of setup for that. Probably for about the past 3 years I've been doing rigging in 3D Studio Max in one form or another. Currently at Neoscape, working a lot with motion capture and a lot of different things like that. Before that I did some rigging for games. So I'm going to go through a couple different types of setups that are commonly used and kind of talk about the benefits of each and show a few tips and tricks that I picked up, and then I want to kind of leave some time for a lot of questions during this presentation, because I know a lot of people have had various different questions that they've come to me. So rather than try to incorporate a ton of different stuff, you know, we're a pretty small group here, so I'll kind of leave it open to you guys. So the three kind of main face rigs in general that get used a lot in the industry are, there's like a morpher type rig, which a lot of you probably know at this point. That's still primarily what they teach here at the New England Institute of Art. That involves either modeling or sculpting. Do you not have like a Windows preview or something on here?
It's a different document type here.
Alright, that's fine. So that involves kind of taking your base mesh of your head and either remodeling or sculpting it into different expressions or phonemes and kind of applying those inside either a modifier or some other type of attribute, and setting up some sort of slider or control system that will allow you to go through and animate directly with those, blending between each other. Then after that, there's kind of one that's a bone-based rig, but it's not really game-centric. It's more of what's known as stretchy bones. And for that type of setup, in general, it can't be supported by an engine, and it's more for like a feature film or something like that. What they'll do is they'll set up joints or bones throughout the face, and they'll set up a system that allows those to stretch and deform, and it kind of is there to simulate muscles in some sense. And then the third type is kind of a static or not stretchy bone-based rig, and primarily that's just for games. The only time you'd really use that type of setup would be for games. So one of the first things I want to bring up here is probably the question that I get the most when people ask me about face rigging is, where should I put joints? Because a lot of people kind of get used to a morpher and then they want to dive into adding joints instead, so they can go into Unreal or something like that, and they don't really know where to start. So in my opinion, a really good place to start kind of investigating that is look at some shots from motion capture shoots. When they do mocap for faces, you can kind of take a look at this and get a good idea. So if they decided that it was important enough to capture motion in that area, you can probably guess that it's a pretty important area in the face, and you probably want to put a joint there as well. And this is pretty similar to a lot of the setups that you'll get for a game rig. You'll have joints placed in pretty much the exact same locations as these a lot of the times. And that's kind of like a really good way that you guys can research and kind of start. This thing is terrible. Killing me. This is kind of a good starting point to research some of these placements and figure out where you might want to start placing joints. So the other thing that you definitely want to do is you want to look at real reference when you're starting out, and it might be even a good idea to grab one of those mocap pictures and kind of blend it in Photoshop right on top of this, so you can see where those line up in relation to where the muscles are in your facial structure. So this is kind of a really important part, and this also gets into some of how you should be modeling your face. It's really important to have really good edge loops in your mesh before you go to even rig it. And if you look at this, you can kind of see you've got this ring of muscle that goes right around your eye here, another ring that goes right around your mouth, and you've got kind of these lines that define some different directions across here. And in general, whenever you look at good topology, something like this, so we've got those very same rings kind of built into this face. This is from Uncharted 2. And if you go back and forth between this and this, you can see that pretty much where those rings fall and where the muscle structure lies line up verbatim, which is definitely something that as you go to start rigging, if you don't have this type of setup, it's going to be very difficult to rig with any of those different types from the get-go. So this is really kind of important to research, and it's worth taking the time for sure. And a lot of times in production, when I was in games, a lot of times it's your job as a rigging artist to go to the model and say, hey, we're going to need the topology to work more like this, or this is not going to function properly. So getting those kind of nailed down before you even start rigging is a really important part for this. So let's go through, talk about a little more in detail. So with morphers, I know that a lot of you guys use that here, and in general, kind of the setup that you get is you take your entire face and you kind of sculpt different faces or model different faces off that. And you have a slider that's like the happy slider, the sad slider, different phonemes, stuff like that. This is an example from a studio called Nexus, and this one's kind of cool because they kind of made this control rig that will affect various morphers across different areas of the face. So it ends up kind of being more like something that you get probably in a feature film environment rather than just like straight sliders. They've got these actual controls, and they're just driving morphs for the most part. There's a couple joints in here, but the vast majority pretty much just morphs, and something like this is really simple to set up, and we'll take a look at how you can do that once we jump into Max. But this is a pretty common type of setup, and this type of rig in general is used a lot for TV shows because it's a lot faster to set up for the most part. Usually in TV, you have very tight deadlines. You've got to wait until you get the script and everything's all designed, and by the time it gets to rigging, you've got to kind of rush to get through it so that the animators can get moving. So this is pretty fast to set up something like this. And usually, in more of like a feature film environment, they would take the time to actually build out a full joint rig. But unfortunately, a lot of times in a TV environment, there just isn't time for that. And this works pretty well. As you can see, he's got a lot of flexibility going on here. And he's just driving morphs for the most part. So then, this one is more of like a feature film type of rig, or at least what I would consider one. And this one is a lot more with joints and special deformers. This one happens to be in Maya, but you could do the same type of setup in Max. And I don't think he ever shows all the actual joints in this video, but he's got the same kind of control panel over here, but you can say there's a lot more flexibility to what's going on within this rig. Someone obviously took a lot of time setting this up to get all these custom deformations, so this is something that you definitely probably wouldn't be able to budget for in something that was really quick for like a TV show. He's also got a really cool system of layered deformers here. So he's got some joints kind of driving different deformations, and then he's got like basically FFDs for everyone who's using Max kind of layered on top of that, which are deforming even more. And that's definitely something that pretty much a lot of these more like feature film style rigs will get. You'll have kind of a joint based setup, and then you'll layer into that some morphs or other deformers, and that'll go directly on top of whatever joint deformations that you get. And yeah, I'll actually just let this one play through because this one's really kind of awesome. Yeah, and stuff like that. That's kind of like the holy grail of rigging. It's to give animators complete freedom over any sort of deformation. When your animator can just go in and grab a rig from you and do any setup that they can imagine, like that's kind of the best case scenario, right? So you can see that there's really no way to break this guy. Like, he kind of goes to town like with all sorts of craziness, and everything stays nice and smooth, nothing like pinches or gets weird and overlapping. And you can do like the most ridiculous expressions with this guy. And you'll see it's pretty simple, but he's got kind of that same general theory of edge loop going on here. And he's done a lot of different deformations on top of each other to kind of get that to flow nicely. So I think that's it for the face stuff. He goes into body. So here are, I've also got a few links that I'll give to Brace so you can email out to you guys that I won't go through right now, but they're kind of really cool like case studies and overviews. So there's one from Benjamin Button, there's one from Uncharted 2, and they kind of go through and talk about different face rigging pipelines that they developed. So I'll definitely have him email those out. And grab a magazine here. I need permission. I tried to copy and paste. That's where I'm at. This is the temp file. Alright, let's try take 2. Alright, so while this is starting up, this is an example from a game that I worked on, and it's a really, really simple face rig that I want to show. And the reason for that was primarily the engine that was being used for this game, and that's going to be a huge factor when you get into any sort of bone-based rig, is where it's going in the end. So for some games it'll be you have a total of 10 joints or fewer to rig the whole face, and for some like Uncharted 2 you'll have 97 joints to rig a face. So it's a huge difference on depending what your end result is going to be. And you can pretty much tell when you look at a lot of these games, which I'm sure you all play all the time, kind of what their budget was if you really study how the face is moving. If you get a guy who can do nothing but blink and open his mouth, you know, like, hey, they had probably like 4 joints to rig that face. Whereas if you get actual emotion through it and storytelling, and you can tell when that character is sad or happy, you know, they probably had a little more budget in terms of what their game engine could handle. Yeah, that's okay. I directly opened it because it wasn't letting me drag out of that file, so. You're killing me. You're killing me. No. Alright, so, yeah, this is a quick version of this rig, and let me just hide some of the face stuff here. So there's our skeleton, and here is the face rig for this character. So essentially what we've got here is this particular game was using biped for its main rig, And then we've got just a quick layer of bones that I threw in here. And you can see for this one, I think it was something like, I don't know, like 10 or 12 bones that I was using for this. Yeah, so it looks like, actually it was more like 20. And that includes kind of some directional controls for the eyes, some blink controls. We've got some stuff in here for cheekbones. We've got a bunch for the mouth, and then an overall jaw. And with this one, it was a pretty simple type of setup. There was not a lot of time budgeted for this, so we didn't go through and have crazy advanced setup. It's pretty much all animator driven in terms of there's not a lot of special stuff going on here. So you can grab any of these and rotate them. In various different ways, and you get whatever deformations, right? So one decision that was made with this game engine early on was that we were going to use this animation rig as the final rig that would be exported into game. So what that means is we didn't have a layer of different rigs on top of each other. And in something like Uncharted 2, you'll get something more like that, where you have a rig that the animator uses, and then a rig on top of that that gets baked down and collapsed, and there's no special controllers or anything like that going with it. So with something like Biped, it's very difficult to script with. If you've ever done any Mac script, the SDK is kind of a mess, so we chose not to go that route for this one. But if you take a look at this face, it kind of really matches a lot with some of those reference images that we were looking at in terms of the placement of these joints. So let me just bring back one of these guys right here. Expand that. So you can see pretty much almost exactly kind of follows this layout that we've got right here. So you've got a main jaw control right down here. You've got kind of this loop that runs around the mouth. And notice a lot of them are clustered right there. That's so you can get a lot of different movement there. Your mouth is pretty flexible muscle, as you can see with that one demo that we looked at, the Vimeo one. That character could do like crazy wide open mouth or completely pinched shut and all that crazy range of motion. So you kind of cluster a lot in there. And then you've got a couple over here for the cheeks. Actually in this one, we don't have one in the middle of the nose. We have kind of two on the side that control the nostrils of the character. So you can get like some flare or some of those kind of effects as the mouth was moving. Got some cheek bones, and then in here we've got a blink controller as well, which you won't really find in the mocap setups. Kind of the eyes are usually done a little separately from that, but that's definitely something that you want to include in any sort of game rig. The eyes are a really important part when you get into face rigging, and you can get all sorts of custom deformers for skin sliding as your pupil moves around underneath your eyelid. This one's just really simple. Upper eyelid can close, the eye can look around underneath that. And then we've got some controls up here for the brow, which are pretty much hidden by her hair. I don't know if I have a hair hide set up in this file, I don't. But we can add one. So what I just did there was I threw an edit poly on top of that. I just went into element mode, selected the skin, and hit Alt-I, and that'll isolate whatever your selection is within edit poly. So a lot of times when I'm doing character rigging, I'll set up kind of a stack of these edit polys that hide and unhide various parts so that I can get in and work with skinning and see what's going on without, hair or whatever else covering up the mesh. So you can see in here we've got some different brow controls, which it's kind of tough to see without the textures, but the textures were huge, so I couldn't email them. But you can see if I turn on edge loops here, I'll actually make this a darker color, so it's a little more apparent. As we go in and start to deform these, you get various amounts of deformation there. And you'll notice that the pivots for all these joints are actually back here in the center of the head. So if I hide that, these all kind of shoot back directly to the center of the skull here. And the reason for that was, again, it comes to an engine limitation for what we were working with at the time. In a game engine, when it calculates the motion of your characters, it's all joint based like this, and it can either calculate one or two different transforms. So you can either get just rotation, which 90% of game characters are, or you can get rotation and position as well. So a lot of the higher end next gen titles, you'll actually have the joints placed directly on the face and their pivot will be there, and the animator can go in and move and rotate them. In this case, we decided to save some frame rate and make it so the animator could just rotate these joints. They can't actually go in and move them in the engine. So you'll see that all the animation that we're getting for this is happening just through rotations here. We don't have to actually go in and move anything at all. So in another circumstance, you may have it so that these joints are placed, and then you can not only go in and rotate them, but you could also go in and move them. So for a quick example of something like that, if you were to take some bones here, and let's turn on snaps, go to faces, and literally for a setup like that, you can go in and just kind of drop directly on the surface with some points, and it looks like I'm on a hidden layer. So let's try that again. And actually I'm going to switch over to helpers. So there we go. So a lot of times I'll start out with some of these rigs by just using helpers to get a placement down, and then I'll go in afterwards and kind of rework and add in the bones on top. So you can see just by turning on snaps and turning on faces, you can pretty much just go in and click drop these into place where you want them. So to get something more like that mocap face, we might put in a few more there. Get one on here. And just kind of drop these in all over based on those points. And actually, just go in and hide that original rig for now. And you can get something like that pretty quickly, and then it's really easy to just snap to pivot and add in your bones after the fact. For the most part, when you're doing a face setup like this, if you're in Max, you can just use those little end kind of nub joints that you get when you right-click and it creates that. You can just have something like that kind of floating in space out here. It doesn't need to be connected to anything, and that'll work just fine. In fact, you could actually just use these helpers right now and turn bone on for them and kind of rig directly to those and skin directly to those. Which, let me actually show that. So if you come in here to Animation Bone Tools, with any selection, you can actually come in and turn bone on, and it'll act like a bone. In 3D Studio Max, you'll get kind of those same effects where if you move an endpoint, it will go beyond the distance, and a lot of those other properties. So a lot of times, people actually prefer to just use a point helper or a dummy object in place of a bone because they don't like the shape or they can't customize it or whatever. Or you could also use custom geometry if you wanted to go in and model some of these to look like underlying parts or anything like that. You can just turn bone on and use that and just link those directly to your head object. For this rig in particular, kind of all those bones that we had up before were just linked directly to the biped head. There was nothing special about that. In some cases, you may not want to have that. You may want to have some other kind of setups here, and that's where you get into something like that proxy rig I was talking about. So an example of that would be, one thing that people do sometimes is they create a spline and they kind of lock one of these helpers to it to simulate some sliding. So if you take like a line, kind of draw this out across here, right? So we've got kind of a shape for that cheekbone. Just go in and smooth that out a little bit. And a lot of times what people do is they'll add in something like that, and they'll just take this point helper here and give it a path constraint and just lock it directly onto that. So now you can see get this to not display as white. There we go. So now if we grab this helper and start to move it, you can see it slides only along that, right? So in this case, we probably wouldn't want to take that helper and link it directly back to the head though. So what we could do is just link the spline to the head instead, so that way the spline's moving with it, and wherever the spline moves, that point's going to follow. So that's one of those examples, and what I would do in this case would be I would add either another bone or another helper. I'll just use a helper for now, and make it a different color. And make this guy a little bit bigger. So in general, what you'd want to do in this situation is you've got kind of this hierarchy here of some sort of advanced setup that you'd like to get into, but you want to be able to bake it down to easily use in a game engine. So what we can do is you can give this second helper here a position constraint and an orientation constraint, and just tell it to follow that guy. And now when you move this spline, you're getting this to follow, and this has its own separate hierarchy. So you can then take this guy, link it back to the skull of your character. It's still going to follow with this perfectly. And what's cool about that kind of setup is you can actually go in and bake that down. So with some of the other constraints in Max, it's not possible to bake down, or they have to have a different hierarchy. In this case, the only thing it's linked to is the skull, the piece that you want. And so one kind of trick is you can come over here to the motion panel, jump into trajectories here at the top, and you can just choose your start and end time to be the full frame range, and you just set the samples to be the full amount. And so let's actually give this guy some quick animation. So we'll turn on, actually it's already animated by default with the path constraint, but we'll just use that. So grab this guy, we set it up the range, I'll hit collapse, right? So now I can just come in here and blow away the spline, blow away that point, and we still get that exact same animation on this point helper that's linked kind of separately. So that's kind of a pretty common thing for face rigging, and for rigging in general. I feel like in games that doesn't really get talked about a lot. So I wanted to kind of mention that. And this is a pretty good setup. What's nice about having this additional controller as well is you can actually get into some custom animation on top of that. You can jump in here to parameters, and you can see that for the position of this guy, it's got kind of this list set up. And right now it's got an initial position XYZ and the position constraint on top of it. This is kind of another one of those tricks that I feel like people use a lot, but it doesn't really get talked about very much. You can actually add in additional things to this list. And let me just actually grab a new point helper here. And just bring this over just so you can see what you get by default. So by default, if you look over here, inside this list, you've got a position with an XYZ and a rotation here. And at any point when you apply any sort of constraints through these menus, it'll set up some additional parameters in here, so that initial position XYZ is still here. You've also got the position constraint, and then you've got one that says available. And at any point you can assign something to available. So you can add a new position XYZ, which is what you started out with initially. And you just have to come down here to the position list and make sure it's active. So now I can move this guy over like that, and as I scrub this, it's still inheriting everything from that guy, but I can animate it separately on top, so I can actually just keyframe it, moving, and they'll now inherit both those transforms. So that's a good way to kind of like get a good starting point. Like, you can use this kind of point helper as a guide, but if your animation really requires you to stretch that cheek muscle up because this girl is smiling really wide, you can go in on top of that and do that and kind of cheat it that way. So that's kind of a really cool one to do, and it's pretty easy to set up. Another thing, so if I bring back this one that I set up, if you look at this one's list, it's got something that says frozen position and then a 0 position XYZ. And all these bones have that. And pretty much any time that you're doing any sort of rigging with bones, they should say that. And the way you get them to say that is you alt-right click on your selected object and you say freeze transform. And it's going to prompt you and you just say yes. You can see this now switches over to frozen position and 0 position XYZ. What that does is it kind of takes that initial XYZ that you had and locks it in space and makes it so that this next one that gets layered on top is a 0 value. And what's cool about that is if you go in and move this guy and rotate it around and do some crazy stuff, and your animator's like, oh man, I need to get back, or you yourself are like, I need to get back to where I started at, you can alt-right click again and say transform to 0. That'll pop you back to the correct place. And that's really important in games, because when you're exporting out these different animations, a lot of times they'll be exported from different max files, and everyone has to be at the same starting point. Every single animation, no matter how many people animated on it, no matter how many files, they all have to start off in whatever that exact initial T-flow was, or you're going to have weird offsets between them, or they won't load properly. So with biped, it's pretty easy. You've got a figure mode that kind of snaps you back to, it's kind of like your home base. With regular max bones, you don't have that. You have to manually set it up. So when you're doing this, you have to make sure that this is the final place that this is going to be. If you're going to make any changes to it, you have to redo it. And you can't have any animation on it already. Anything that's animated about this is going to get blown away when you apply this. It's going to just zero out those values. So you definitely want to do this before you start animating. Let's see. So, I mean, that's pretty much kind of the gist for a simple game rig like that. You kind of go in, get those points in place, and go from there, depending on what your game engine can handle, essentially. And then I wanted to go through quickly kind of that stretchy bone setup, and then we'll get into some questions. So this technique has been around for a pretty long time. The first guy to do it in 3D Studio Max was this guy, Paul Neal, and he's pretty much the authority on rigging in 3D Studio Max. I don't know if we have his DVDs here in the library at school, but he has tons of demos online that you can watch for free. And let's see, a lot of like weird politicians or something. That's the actual Paul Neal. He's a pretty cool guy. So this DVD right here, he put this out years ago, but it's probably the best DVD I've ever seen on face rigging in 3D Studio Max. I can't find the one picture I want, right? Anyway, so kind of his setup is something more like, let me just turn these guys off. So what he does is, rather than going through and placing points, he kind of draws lines across the surface of the mesh that he wants to use. So let me actually hide that stuff again. So he kind of draws that line that follows the topology around the eye, around the mouth, and he'll draw some of those muscle lines, like where you get those kind of different directions that flow over the character. And he does it with a string of bones, and then he makes those have stretchy properties. So you're going in and moving kind of the in-between points, and the bones are stretching and deforming the same way your muscles would under your face. So I just want to do one quick strand here over on the side, and we'll kind of keep it off here so we can see it easier, but we'll kind of follow just this form in the cheek right here. So I'm going to come over here, grab a bone chain, and draw out something like that. So if we bring this over here and let's just move it forward. So kind of flows something like that. And what I want to be able to do is kind of squash and deform this from either end. So I want to be able to grab this base and move it and keep this point up here planted, or this point up here and move that and keep this base planted, or either of these in between. So what we'll do is I'll just grab some point helpers for each bone, pick each one, and just use the align tool to align and position and orientation to each of these bones. And for this last one, I'm actually using this weird little nub bone that Max creates. They usually just go in and delete. It's very important to have that in this setup because you need this end bone to be kind of docked in some way, and it needs to have something there that's actual physical geometry. So for each one of these, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the bone itself. So it's kind of hard to see that it's selected, but select the bone, not the helper. Come up here to animation constraints. I don't want to position constrain it to the helper that's right at its base. And I want it to look at the next point. So we'll do constraints, look at constraint, and then choose the next one up here in the chain. You'll notice that everything kind of snaps out of place, which is fine. It's supposed to happen. And you just kind of work your way down the chain. So we'll grab the next bone, constraints, position, the helper at its base, and constraints, look at the next one. And same thing for this guy. Constraints, position, constraints, look at, and the final one here. The final one just needs the position because there's nothing for it to look at. So what we get now is this system where we can grab these helpers and pull these around, and you see that kind of our base of our joints here are staying in place, and we're getting this nice kind of stretchy effect going on in between. So you can really easily start to simulate some of that muscle pulling. And if we select all these guys and bring them over here, we can alt-right click, freeze the transforms on these, and now if you go in and start to animate any of these, you can at any point come back, select these, and zero them back out to get to where you started. And something like this gets used a lot for feature film setups because it can be a lot more flexible. It's not something that you could export easily to a game engine, but it is a little more versatile, in my opinion, to just placing joints directly or to just using morphers. So if you're using morphers, you can get something kind of really solid that you know works, but with this, you can kind of account for unforeseen changes. So if your script called for this character to be sad the whole time, but then something gets changed and he needs to be surprised at the end, that would mean for you, if you were doing morph targets, you'd have to go in and sculpt like a surprised face or kind of try to mix together what you had already. With this one, you can kind of go in and just rework the mesh just through this. And a lot of times what happens then is you get some weird pinching, some weird deformations that can happen. And at that point, especially with a rig like this, people will actually make a combination of the two different types. And what I mean by that is they'll add in a morpher on top, and they'll do what's called corrective blend shapes. So they'll kind of pull this out, and say you're doing like a really wide smile, so they'll pull that for there, and cheekbone's going to come up, something like that. You're going to get some serious pinching in some of these places. This mesh just wasn't made to handle that. And it's the same as that Vimeo example we looked at. If you were to just rig that straight up with this and try to get it so that the whole side of his mouth came open like the T-Rex thing, it would definitely not stretch that perfectly. So what you do is you grab a morpher, throw it on top of this, and same way as you're used to, you kind of just take a snapshot of that, do your sculpting, do whatever fixes. But then what you do is, because we set up that kind of zero relationship with all these point helpers, you can actually wire those morphs directly to the position values of these. So at 0, this will actually give you a position readout of 0. So when you go into do your wire parameters, it'll actually start at that, and it'll go up to 100 based on how far it moves. So what you can do is just kind of layer a quick morph directly on top, and then just right-click wire parameters and choose that morph. And I don't have any set up yet, so I can't, but you can go through for each one that has any issues and kind of set up these corrective shapes on top of it, and that adds a whole nother layer of what you can do with this. You can also just add in, if there's additional shapes that you can't get with some of your bones, you can definitely go in and just add straight up morphers for that, and kind of link them to little controls that you place directly on the face. A couple of ones that we looked at, they kind of built a little control box over on the side, which, in all honesty, all you do for that is you set up a bunch of shapes and you give them relationships. So usually there's like a master box that goes around the whole thing. Then they'll do like something for the eye, and they'll do, I don't know, maybe like a line for an eyebrow here. And they'll set up a bunch of these different shapes. They'll take all these and link them to this master so that you have something you can move around. They'll go in and freeze these the exact same way we did for joints. And then we'll just wire these directly to either positions or morphs or anything else in their scene. So you can just come in here, right-click wire parameters, transform. You can grab zero position for this guy, choose whatever axis. Or the other cool thing that they like to do a lot is they'll add in, you'll kind of see this, you get almost like a slider effect a lot of times. So they'll add in a line vertically for this eyebrow, say, and they'll take this guy and they'll go animation, constraints, path constraint, lock this guy on there, and mouse is killing me. As you move this in the viewport, if you have a larger screen resolution, you'll be able to actually just physically grab this out here and kind of pull it up and down. But what that gives you is an actual percentage value that you can work with right here. So rather than trying to guess where your XYZ values are and how far you have to move this guy, you can just know that it's going to go from 0 to 100 every single time. And that's pretty much all we do for any of these control kind of boxes like that. And a lot of people always ask that, but honestly, it's not something that I do very much anymore. I think kind of an industry trend in the past couple years has been animators tend to like their controls more directly on the face. So you get a lot of stuff like this where you'll make like a circle and just kind of align it to one of these helpers. And what you can do is grab this helper, same way we did before, just give this quick position constraint. So now when you move this, it controls it. And animators like that for a couple reasons. One is they can jump over here to the display, hide bone objects, hide helper objects, and just have these kind of shapes that they're driving that animation with. They can hit Shift S, which hides shapes, on and off as they're working, so they can kind of view their whole mesh and then toggle that back on. And they can come up here to the selection rollout, and they can just switch this over to shapes so that they don't have to worry about accidentally animating a piece of their mesh as they work. You can see I can no longer select this mesh, I can only select this shape, which is driving whatever animation I've got going on. So that's kind of my brief overview of those three things. So I wanted to open it up to questions at this point on pretty much anything rig related and see what you guys were interested in knowing more about. Yeah.
Are you going to be showing other tutorials do you have any other good tutorials to look at?
Good tutorials to look at?
Yeah.
So that guy Paul Neal, he has, in my opinion, the best one. But I do have some other links here. So here's one that CG Society did for Benjamin Button. And this one's less of a tutorial and more of overall theory, but they talk a lot about kind of the setups they use and how they drove their face animation through some different motion capture. But it's definitely very related to rigging. We've got this guy, Chris Evans. He posts awesome stuff about rigging all the time. I'm on his blog always whenever he posts new stuff. And he posted this one. This one's a little older, but it's definitely very relevant. This is for Metal Gear Solid 4. They kind of had this revolutionary workflow that they did for face rigging, where they had this kind of base, really simple human face mesh that what they would do is they would have this one mesh that they could remodel and retopologize all their main characters' faces, but they would kind of just match this one underlying mesh to it. And what they would do is they would attach these joints to the surface of that mesh, and then they could run their morphs for any character through this one mesh, because, you know, for a morph target you have to have the same topology throughout. So they could kind of reuse that same topology, and they use what's called progressive morphing. So that means you've got a morph that the base mesh is not going to change. It's going to be like an offset rather than a global position change. So when you have a smile in this one face and you apply that same one to a character who has a more round face or thinner face, it's not going to replace what's there, it's going to add to it. It's an additive process. So then they had that baked into these joints. So essentially they did one set of all their phonemes, one set of all their emotions, and they were able to reuse that on every single character. So there's a cool article about that. And the Uncharted one is pretty awesome. And this is actually on the GDC vault. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but every year there's this thing called GDC, and all the best of the best guys in games go and talk about all the cool stuff they've been doing for the last year. And then GDC is cool enough to post a lot of those talks for free online, so you can come here and watch them. This one's a video, so I'm not going to wait for it to load, but Brace will send out the link for that. And there's another one in here, which is another GDC talk actually. And in this one they show some of their face rigging setups for one of the Star Wars games.
For starters, how long do you think it takes to go through the first process of visual rigging?
So when you say the first process, you mean like your first time?
Yeah. Like how long of a process is it?
It really kind of depends. So if it's a setup that's something more like this, where it's kind of like stretchy moments and there's some more to fix things, you know, it could take a much longer time, maybe like a week or two. Whereas if it's something more simple, like that, the initial kind of game rig that I showed, maybe a day for that. So I would say, for the most part, most of the studios I've been at, most of the rigging artists that I've talked to, the general consensus is you get about a week to rig a character. 3 days of that are dedicated to setting up the joints of bones. The other 2 are dedicated to skinning. And then you have some time after that where usually you work directly with an animator and you kind of sit down and be like, all right, try and break this. Like that's, and then you go through and do some fixes afterwards. But I would say anywhere from a day to half a day in terms of production pipeline. But if you're starting out and you're doing it for the first time, it's obviously going to take a lot longer. So.
It's a lot.
When you skin the bones to face, do you get envelopes? Like how do you adjust your envelopes? Like obviously like adjust them, but like how big or how much space?
So I actually really don't use envelopes at all when I rig. I do all paint weights. So if you check out the skinning on this character in particular, if you look at this, actually don't even have envelopes visible on any of these. Let me turn that off so you can see the hair. So kind of the process that I use as I go through this, yeah, you can't even, I think I just turned the envelopes down to 0 because they were bugging me and getting in the way as I was working. But in general, what I'll do is I'll check this vertices box right here at the top. I'll select all, and I'll come down here to this icon right here. I don't even know what it's supposed to be. It's like a weird little old school TV from the 80s or something. So hit that guy. That's going to lock in all your weights, and then I use this little wrench right here called the weight tool in conjunction with the paint weights, which is right down here below that. So usually what I'll do is I'll grab this guy and just start to paint in. And usually at this point in the process I'll use like a Wacom tablet and start to paint in some weights. One thing that I usually do before that is I'll actually select all the verts and I'll just grab like an arbitrary bone in the mesh. Usually if it's biped, I'll grab like BIP 01. If it's something else, it could just be kind of the root bone. Doesn't really matter. And I'll just weight everything solid 1 to that random joint. And then I'll go in and start to paint individual joints from there so that I know exactly what I've touched and what I haven't. So you kind of get this weird stretching at first, but it kind of forces you to go through and check every single part of your mesh. And that's something with envelopes that it can be kind of difficult to tell where you've worked on and what you haven't, because sometimes they get you like part of the way there, sometimes they don't, sometimes you miss an area, and you kind of have to go back over and readjust it. So usually just from the get-go I'll do that, just as like a starting point, and then I'll go in and paint everything individually, and I'll just use a lot of this weight tool, like the blend function lets you just select a group of verts that you've kind of already overlapped some weighting, and it'll give you like a nice soft fall off in there. So go in and select like the skull bone for this, and just hit blend right here, and it'll kind of give you a nice soft fall off between those points, like that. And it's pretty much the exact same process throughout the face. That was how I did all the setup for that. It was just kind of grabbing all that, putting a crazy expression on the bones, and then going through one at a time and painting those weights in. Anything else, guys? Yeah, it is a cool character. This character was done by a guy, Ed Brillant. He's a pretty cool character modeler. He has a pretty sweet blog. I'll add that into our list of cool things that Briggs. I think it's this one. No, it's not. He updated it. What a jerk. He used to have this really funny like caricature of himself that he drew, but he does all sorts of insane character sculpts and all sorts of cool stuff. So definitely check out his stuff.
Are you going to be teaching the rigging class here?
Hopefully. Hopefully next semester. We'll find out.
Or quarter.
Or quarter. Ah. Next quarter.
Well, thank you, Vinny, for...
So yeah, when Grace sends out that email, he'll also include my personal email. If you guys ever have any questions about rigging, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, thanks.
So are we going to F10 and see if the thing's saved?
We are.